Dear ladies and gentlemen, my name is Martin Fischer, and on behalf of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom, I would like to welcome you to our web talk, Neighboring Russia, Japan after Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine. Once again, we have been able to attract renowned experts who will give us an insight into how the Russian war on Ukraine is leading to global change in foreign and security policy. We will focus on Japan in the coming minutes. How did Japan respond to the war against Ukraine? What changes in foreign and security policy can be seen after just a little over 1 year? It is my great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to Professor James D.J. Brown. Mr. Brown is professor as well as advisor and coordinator of International Affairs major at Temple University in Tokyo, Japan. His areas of expertise are Russian-Japan relations, as well as Russian foreign policy and Japanese foreign policy. How appropriate. Dear James, thank you for explaining Japanese policy and answering questions from the audience today. This web talk will be moderated by my valued colleague, Sophia Brachtendorf, who works as a program officer for the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation's Korea office. Dear Sophia, a warm welcome to you as well, and thank you for your support. The floor is yours.
Okay, then thank you for the welcome, Martin. I'd also like to welcome our audience to this web talk about Japan's stance towards Russia after the start of the Ukraine war. We have prepared many interesting questions. And I would also like to welcome again Professor Brown. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Just a quick notice, we have a Q&A tab here on Zoom. So if you have any questions and follow us through Zoom, then feel free to drop your questions and we try to find the time to go through at the end of our web talk. So shall we jump right into it? And maybe you could give us a short introduction of the characteristics of Japan's foreign policy strategy over the past few years in general, and maybe also in regard to Russia specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. So firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to join you. So if we begin by talking about Japan's foreign policy strategy over the last few years, I think where we have to begin is talking about insecurity. During the Cold War era, Japan, of course, did have some concerns about the Soviet Union, but generally its security situation was pretty good. There wasn't really believed to be a clear and pressing threat of a Soviet attack. The United States then achieved such a hegemonic position in the 1990s that Japan felt pretty secure. That situation's now very much changed. Japan feels that it is facing an unprecedented situation of threat with the threat of North Korea, deep concerns about China, and then also Russia as well. And at the same time, the United States is being seen as a somewhat less reliable partner, in part because of relative decline, but also fears that at some point the United States might decide to withdraw its security commitment. And those concerns were particularly prominent during the Trump era. So that's the overall picture when it comes to Japan's foreign policy strategy. Their response has been to try and do more with the United States, to do more for themselves by building up the self-defense forces, and also doing more with others, principally with India and Australia, but also European countries too. When it comes to Russia, under the previous Prime Minister Abe, his approach was to try and improve relations with Russia, so that at least with Japan's northern neighbor, there would be stable ties. And so he really tried to engage with Putin as much as possible, including after the annexation of Crimea. He tried to establish a friendship with Putin, to build economic ties, and really to make Russia a partner. Obviously, that didn't work out.
And could you explain further how exactly Japan reacted to the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year?
Yeah, so I mean, the main priority for the Japanese government has been to respond in lockstep with the rest of the G7. That's a message that the government has consistently stressed, that they will ensure that there is no real distance between their position and other G7 members. So that's meant that Japan has introduced very tough sanctions. That's really quite unprecedented for Japan. Japan in the past was pretty reluctant to introduce sanctions on major countries, but they've gone ahead with round after round of sanctions. They've also committed to phasing out imports of Russian oil and coal. They've committed to providing Ukraine with more than $7 billion in financial assistance, and they've also agreed to transfer military equipment, which is something that Japan has not done previously. Now, I should say that that doesn't include lethal military equipment, so it's not arms, but it's other things of use to Ukraine.
Well, you mentioned before that especially Abe was very friendly towards Russia, and even after the annexation of Crimea, nothing really happened. Why do you think this changed this time? Like, what is different this time? What is at stake for Japan now?
Yeah, so I think that there are a couple of factors driving this. So one is public opinion, actually. So public opinion in Japan has been very supportive of providing assistance to Ukraine. Some of the polling data on this is quite interesting. So more than 73% of Japanese, when polled, said they supported sanctions against Russia, even if that had negative effects on the Japanese economy. Added to that, when Prime Minister Kishida visited Kyiv in March of this year, 74% of Japanese said that they were in favor of the visit. So Japan's government is in part responding to public opinion, but there's a bigger factor as well. And the biggest factor is actually Japan's own national security, because the Japanese government sees a clear connection between the Ukraine invasion and security in East Asia. And this has been stressed by Prime Minister Kishida with very much a slogan that he's adopted. He keeps saying, Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow. And so what he means by that is that if Russia can launch this unprovoked attack against Ukraine, then there's a real risk that perhaps China could do the same thing against Taiwan. And if there were to be a conflict over Taiwan, it would directly affect Japanese security. So that's encouraged Japan's tough response. They want to ensure that Russia does not succeed in Ukraine. Because if Russia were to succeed, their concern would be that China might be emboldened to try the same thing against Taiwan. And furthermore, by helping out with European security, the Japanese government wants to encourage a scenario that if there is a crisis in East Asia, then European countries will in turn help Japan. So that's what's guiding Japan's response.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. That's really interesting. I was wondering if we know that Japan and Russia have some dispute about territories. They both claim for each other about the northern territories or the Kuril Islands, especially considering the fact that Japan and the Soviet Union back after the end of World War II didn't sign a proper peace treaty. And I think in March this year, there were some sites of Russian warships in this area. Do you see any potential escalation there as well?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the territorial dispute was another motivation for Abe. That's another reason why he really pushed for close relations with Russia. Since the invasion of Ukraine and Japan's introduction of sanctions, those talks about actually signing a peace treaty have been cut off. That Russia has formally ended those talks and has branded Japan an unfriendly country. So those talks are not going anywhere now. But to be honest, even before that, it had long become clear that they were not really proceeding towards a resolution of that dispute. Abe never really got any results from his engagement with Putin. And this was made especially clear in 2020 when Russia revised its constitution, because whilst a lot of the attention was on the change to permit Putin to have more terms as president, the revised constitution also included the new clause which made it illegal for Russia to transfer any of its territory to anyone else. And so that pretty much closed the door on the territorial dispute and Japan's hopes. As to the military aspect, so Russia holds the islands at the moment. They've held them since 1945, and there are Russian forces permanently based on those islands. There was a Newsweek article in recent times which suggested that Russia had actually considered attacking Japan in August 2021. But I don't think it's really a credible report. There's a big difference between attacking Ukraine and attacking Japan as a treaty ally of the United States. So I think we can dismiss that as a concern. But nonetheless, Russia can be a troublemaker to the north of Japan, especially if it coordinates its military activities with China.
So in the regard of China, do you see any real, how likely do you think it might happen that China turns to Taiwan and therefore also drags East Asia into conflict?
Yeah, I mean, that's the major concern for Japan. It's their real sort of strategic nightmare. So part of it just comes from looking at the geography of Japan. Japan has somewhat unfortunate geography given its neighbors, that Russia to the north, and you have North Korea, China, and then you've got South Korea, which should be its natural partner. But whilst things are looking up a bit at the moment, more often than not, you have tensions there rather than friendship. But the real strategic nightmare, as I say, is if you have China seizing Taiwan and then Russia ganging up on Japan and assisting China in some way. And it's open to speculation, really, what Russia would do in the case of China attacking Taiwan. But there was a rather worrying comment by Putin recently. When the Chinese defense minister was recently visiting Moscow, Putin made some comments about the Russian Pacific Fleet, saying that in the future, the Russian Pacific Fleet could be used in regional conflicts in any direction. And so maybe the hint there was perhaps in the future that Russia could assist China in some way over Taiwan. But I don't think that's probably a genuine possibility. I don't think Russia really wants to become involved in a conflict over Taiwan. I think rather it was designed as a threat directed towards the West, towards Japan, to say, if you keep pushing us towards China by isolating us, then it could have negative effects for your own security.
Then I would like to move on to the Japanese military, which you mentioned shortly before too. So Japan technically is not allowed to have a military on its own, right? So they need to rely somewhat on their allies, such as the US. So do you think that the war situation in Ukraine somehow shaped the public opinion about the acceptance of their peace institution?
Yeah. I think maybe a starting point there is to provide a bit of clarity about the status quo with the self-defense forces. So you're exactly right. The Constitution is a peace constitution. It includes a paragraph which says that Japan renounces war. It also sets out that Japan is not permitted to have land, sea, or air forces. And yet, over the decades, that has been interpreted so broadly that Japan's self-defense forces are already pretty capable. Japan's in the top 10 for military spending internationally. But the reason why they're insufficient is more because of just how insecure Japan's security situation is. So the government takes the view that the self-defense forces need to have significantly greater capabilities. And the ruling Liberal Democratic Party has long held this view, believing that Japan needs to spend more on defense, have fewer legal restrictions on what they can do, and also to have a greater range of weapons. So that view was held by the government before the invasion of Ukraine. What has changed is more public opinion. Public opinion was long a brake, a restriction on Japan's government ability to make those changes. But the shock of the Ukraine invasion has convinced much of the Japanese population that those changes need to be made. So now the government is able to move forward with its agenda. So what it's specifically doing is moving towards a target of 2% of GDP to spend on defense from 1% at the moment, so a very big increase. And also committing to acquiring strike capabilities so that Japan can hit, in theory, enemy bases far from Japan's shores. So those are some of the biggest changes that have been made.
Well, do you think that realistically, I think before there have been some attempts to change the constitution in a way to get rid of the self-defense aspect. Do you think that the war situation in Ukraine could potentially give the final push to make room for this change, to finally amend the constitution in that way?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the hurdle is still seen as too high. So what you need in order to change the constitution is 2/3 of both the lower house and the upper house, and then for it, in addition, to be approved in a referendum. And polling at the moment indicates that there is not enough public support for that. So the government's approach instead is just to stick with the current constitution, but just to reinterpret it more and more in a more and more ambitious way. And there has even been debate about the possibility of nuclear weapons being deployed in Japan. I know that's obviously been a big discussion point when it comes to South Korea, but one of the last major contributions to Japanese politics before Abe was assassinated is that he raised the idea of nuclear sharing for Japan, so that in theory the United States could base nuclear weapons here. And the LDP, at least some members of the LDP, believe that that too would be consistent with the constitution. So as I say, the goal at the moment is not actually to revise it, but just to reinterpret it.
That's really surprising to me that still what you mentioned with all the threats around with China, Russia, North Korea, now the current situation in Ukraine, that public opinion still is not in favor of making this change to give more strength to the military. How about public opinion in the energy sector about the energy supply? So I think within the European Union, the gas and oil supplies from Russia have been quite a debate. And as far as I know, Japan is quite poor in resources. So I think therefore they're very vulnerable when it comes to shocks on the energy market globally. So what kind of effect did Russia's attack on Ukraine have on Japan's energy supply?
So to answer that, I really need to divide it up by energy type. So oil, coal, and gas, they're very different situations for each. So if we take Japan's reliance on Russian energy before the invasion, it was that 3.6% of Japan's oil came from Russia, about 10% of its coal, and about 9% of its liquefied natural gas. So you have different numbers there, and you can see that dependence on Russia for oil was always quite low. So that wasn't too much of a concern. Also, with regard to coal, the judgment was made that there are alternatives available. Japan was confident that they would be able to import coal from elsewhere. So that's why they committed to phasing out Russian oil and Russian coal, and they've done that quite successfully. There have been big drops in their imports of both oil and coal from Russia. The exception, the really difficult area, is liquefied natural gas. So 9% might not sound that much, but the concern there was that Japan would struggle to find alternative supplies of liquefied natural gas. And even if they could find them, they might be prohibitively expensive. And so the view was that Japan needed to keep importing it. So they've kept their imports of liquefied natural gas, and Japanese companies have retained their stakes in major energy projects on Sakhalin Island, just to the north of Japan. And so it's a bit of a mixed picture when it comes to energy. And if you wanted to be critical of Japan's stance towards Russia, I think you would focus on that gas area. But the Japanese government says, you know, we're in a difficult position. If we cut that off, then that's going to have a major impact on energy prices within the country.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting to compare the situation in Japan and to the European Union. So it seems like the energy situation is not that much of a debate over there. I got a question from our audience to compare the military situation between Germany and Japan, because we know that Germany after the war also was quite limited in their military, but then obviously over the years, over the decades, that changed. While for Japan, they're still stuck with their peace constitution. So could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I think it's always really interesting to make that comparison between Japan and Germany, a similar, you know, direction of movement. I think what we can say perhaps though is that Germany has moved further than Japan has. Japan is also changing, and I think some additional changes will take place. And I think eventually the peace constitution will be revised, but the pace of change is just slower. So to take a concrete example, there is some debate about whether Japan should actually provide weapons to Ukraine. And there are some within the ruling party who are in favor of this, but at the moment there's still too much resistance within Japanese politics and amongst the public. And so what they're doing instead is providing this non-lethal assistance. So things like bulletproof vests, surveillance drones, winter uniforms, they provided too. But when it comes to actually providing something like, you know, tanks, you know, arms of other types, then Japan just sees that as a step too far. So Japan is going through its own major change, but it's just a slower process than I think has occurred within Germany.
Do you think this could also be accelerated through the threat coming from Russia or China, or maybe that the attack of Russia on Ukraine could serve as a to make progress on that?
It depends on external circumstances. So we're already seeing public opposition reducing. And I think that as the public gets used to Japan playing a bigger role internationally and becoming more of a normal security actor, that will continue. So that's one possibility, that we just continue with this gradual evolution, but there could also be a major shock. So Japan has a territorial dispute with China over the Senkaku Islands. I mean, to be technically correct, Japan denies that there's any dispute, but they disagree over those islands. If those islands were to be seized by China, that would suddenly push Japan onto a different path, and we would then see a more rapid acceleration of Japan purchasing, developing more of its own weapons, and reducing some of the remaining restrictions.
And I will also be interested in, you mentioned all these security threats within the region, some fear of the Japanese prime minister that maybe the East Asian region could be the next Ukraine. What's your outlook on the Japan-Russia relations. So we've heard so far that with the start of the attack on Ukraine, they've pretty much come to a halt, or they don't seem going too great. What's your outlook on maybe after when the war ends one day, or in the future? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the key point here will be, again, the G7 and the United States. I don't think Japan will want to be an outlier. I don't think they're going to move faster than anyone else. I think they would wait to see what the approach would be taken by Washington and other capitals, and then they would begin their own engagement. But lingering also in the minds of Japanese policymakers will be the experience of Abe. Abe, for years and years, put everything into trying to improve the relationship with Russia. And in return, he got nothing. And so I think that will leave a long-term imprint in the minds of policymakers. And they might feel that, Russia fooled them once, but they're not going to be fooled again.
And we have another question from the audience. Could you elaborate a bit more on the Kuril Island dispute, and if there's a risk that maybe Russia also attempts to annex these the same way they did with Crimea?
So I've written a book about the territorial dispute, so it's my opportunity to kind of advertise that. But yeah, so the dispute here is reasonably stable, actually, because Russia already holds all of the territory that it wants. It's in possession of all 4 of the disputed islands, and so Russia's actually quite happy with the status quo. So that means that we're unlikely to see a scenario of Russia suddenly making a land grab. There are some Russian nationalists who optimistically claim that Hokkaido, the most northerly island, should also belong to Russia. But that's very much an extremist view. And with Japan being a treaty ally of the United States, with the United States committed to defending Japan, including with nuclear weapons, we can pretty much rule out any attack on Hokkaido.
Okay, so I think we have 3 minutes left. I think it would be great to hear what do you think will be the maybe biggest threat so far for Japan and from the East Asian region, out of like Russia, China, you mentioned North Korea. What is the most pressing one to solve for now?
Yeah, so fortunately, the Japanese government directly answers that question, because they have an annual white paper called The Defense of Japan, which sets out their main security challenges, and they put them in order. And in the past, some years ago, North Korea was number 1. That was seen as the main threat because of its nuclear weapons, because it keeps firing missiles in the direction of Japan. But it's now been replaced, and top of the list is China. So China is seen as the most serious threat, then it's North Korea, and in third place is Russia. But Russia is seen as more of a threat to the broader international order, the rules-based order. It's not seen as so much of a direct threat to Japan's national security in the sense of Russia potentially attacking. So it's a different sort of a threat from North Korea or China.
Well, in that term, it could maybe be a good way for Japan to, again, reinforce themselves as a global actor, to stick to G7, to follow the sanctions regime, and to make a statement there against Russia for the rules-based global order, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And those institutions and organizations are very important for Japan. So the key relationships with the United States. But a big thing for Japan in recent years has been the quadrilateral strategic dialogue, which brings Japan together with the United States, Australia, and India as well. But the other development that's been really interesting is that Japan has really deepened its relations with NATO. And a recent announcement is that NATO is now going to open a liaison office in Tokyo. And so that's really showing that Japan is developing closer ties with other NATO members and not just the United States.
Okay. We have one last question from the audience. I think if I interpreted correctly, it refers to Alaska that got sold to America in the 19th century. And I think probably this refers again to the Kiowa Islands, Northern Territory, if there's attempts to somehow get them back into Japanese territory. What is your take on that?
Yeah, so this is similar to those claims made by some Russian nationalists to Hokkaido. So at the most optimistic, the most extreme end of the Russian nationalist spectrum, you have some people who desire the return of Alaska, regretting the fact that it was sold to the United States, also putting forward arguments that Russia was in some way cheated, tricked into making that sale. But really that's in the realm of almost fairy tales, that I can't see how Russia would ever get Alaska back. But yeah, certainly some Russian nationalists do raise that.
Okay, yeah, I think we're running out of time here. So I would like to thank you for sharing your expertise on this topic with us. Thank you to the audience also for participating with many interesting questions. And yeah, Martin, please.
Yeah, dear Sophia and James, I learned a lot on the topics that I had little knowledge on. So thank you very much for this talk. And dear guests, usually at the end of our web talks, you will find out which topic we will continue with next week. But unfortunately, after 10 episodes of Neighbouring Russia, we have reached the end of the series. The series was a special project for the foundation because we were able to bring the expertise of our colleagues in some far-flung regions to Germany. And in addition, we had the great pleasure to presenting speakers from the respective states whom you probably do not know from the German media. So thank you very much for your interest and thank you very much for your participation. And I hope to welcome you at further events of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. Goodbye.